Last time we let's say we stopped at your expulsion from Oxford. You told me that you afterwards you wrote that the Black Sunlight, or the House of Hunger.
Yeah, and after the House of Hunger, Black Sunlight.
But in what time? I mean, how did you live in that time that you wrote Black Sunlight? Still with friends?
Yeah. There was a couple. He was studying, Peter and Sheila. They were also students at the university there, also doing English language and literature. And they, they had this apartment, which was just a large bedroom and a small kitchen. And so what they did was they ripped out their stove and their fridge from the kitchen and put it in their bedroom, and then installed a bed and a desk in the kitchen, and simply said, here's a sleeping bag. This is your room now. You can stay there for as long as we are also here in Oxford. That was. I stayed with them most of the time. I was writing the House of Hunger. They were English. Peter's parents came from Cambridge, and Sheila's parents came from Sussex. He is actually he's the one who taught me about publishing your own work. I mean, we used to have these furious debates at night about poetry, and he would read his poems to me, and I'd read some of my own poems to him, as well as the passages of House of Hunger which I had finished, and he would criticize and so on and so on. And so he's already published three of his own. He published himself three of his own collections of poems. So you see, I did have some good support from people who were well aware of the importance of literature in their own lives, and so could tolerate my dark moods. Because sometimes I'd get too drunk and come home about 3 a.m. shouting, screaming my head off. And especially times when I couldn't write. I mean, House of Hunger was very difficult to write for me. Because, you see, those of us who had gone to England or to any other country away from Ian Smith, we were expected to get degrees. We were expected to make good examples of ourselves. And after independence, to return here, with total dignity and respect. And then, and of course, here I was, having been expelled once again from Oxford, and doing nothing at all except writing and drinking. That's when it started to be. That's when most of the Zimbabwean community, exile community there, the Zimbabwean emigrants, started moving away from me and even beating me up. Simply saying that was you're a bad example of, you represent the worst of what you could make yourself become. You've destroyed your whole educational prospects, and you're giving Zimbabweans a bad image and so on and so on. I managed to tell them to fuck off, and just went on writing and writing.
But is it true that you told me last time that you wrote some short stories as well?
Oh yeah.
Was that during the time that you were at Oxford?
Yeah.
Studying?
Yeah, before I was expelled. Especially not the main section. You see, the main section of the House of Hunger is the House of Hunger itself.
Yeah. All the other, afterwards.
Yeah. All the other short stories in the same book, I wrote them long before I had been expelled. That man had been keeping them in a drawer. And when I finished writing the House of Hunger, I sent it to Heinemann in London on its own. I wanted it published on its own as a novella. And they accepted it, but they said that the book, when published, would be too small, and that did I have any other material. And so I sent them all the rest of the short stories.
But had you published them before in magazines or something? Those short stories.
I think. There was the University Literary Society, and then also the university magazines, the ISIS. Yeah, I put some material in there. And then I'd also been sending some material down to London, but well, without too much success. Most of those short stories actually appear for the first time in the House of Hunger. I remember it was very difficult for me to actually know how to get by. You know, how to actually know the rules of the game, how to deal with publishers, how to deal with contracts, typing or whatever. I mean, I had to learn by myself through trial and error, you know. And I mean, I now know most of the things about publishing. What kind of a contract to refuse to sign, what kind of a contract to accept. And then also the kind of internal discipline required. In other words, for instance, I was drinking a lot when I was writing The House of Hunger. But I would never write when I was drunk. I never write when I'm drunk or when I'm smoking dope. No. Most people think I do, but I don't.
Is that for principal reason?
Yeah. I tried once. You know, you see, the thing is that the English literature I'd been studying at the time is not very interesting for a third world person with, as it were, a revolutionary background. It's straight-laced, it's complacent, and on the whole conservative. They did not really have the equivalent of the United States, let's say 1950s and 60s, the big generation writers who were actually protesting against their whole establishment. I mean, poets like Allen Ginsberg, writers like Kerouac, Gary Snyder, and then Timothy Leary. I mean, someone like Timothy Leary in England would have been totally seen as some sort of monster. No, it's what I mean is that in English literature there was no such tradition. The only protest edition, protesting in literature was the period of the between 1950 and 1955. We know when the angry young men like Colin Wilson, the outsider, and that playwright, all these highly educated or at least highly knowledgeable writers who were writing for the first time against the very conservative middle class element of English literature. In other words, you see, I had to cast my eye around to find a literary tradition which would fit into my own experience and totally reject all the modules I've been taught from English literature. That was one of the problems, actually. I mean, that's when I started reading in most European literature in translation, in Japanese literature in translation, Russian literature in translation. The novella, actually, the form, I got it from reading the German 19th century novella, especially from, I think it's Kleist, and so on and so on. Trying to experiment with a form which gave the largest range to my own experiences, emotions, and so on and so on, but at the same time not be so highly personal as to be opaque or meaningless to the reader.
But what kind of influences you got from the American tradition? All those people you mentioned, you read them.
Yeah.
Ginsberg and Leary and Kerouac.
Yeah. That's when also I started experimenting with dope. And the one of the problems I have now, for instance, is that the majority of my people went through the 1960s and 70s totally untouched by the, as it were, the flower generation or the student protests in 1967, 68, and so on. In other words, but you see, I was going through that, trying to experiment with flower power, with dope, with rejecting the system totally, and only associating with those people who were also like me, searching for something better than an academic certificate, finding that the spirit is, well, not really the spirit, because that's religion and I have no religion. reading about the Hells Angels, about the San Francisco experience, let's say in Ashbury, or taking part in demonstrations, because remember, London is actually got, and Oxford also has got a large black population, and
West Indies.
Yeah, and the one stupid thing about Britain is that the majority of the black British who are citizens there, because they were born there, the majority of them are uneducated. They are not encouraged to get education, let's say up to university level, and so the majority of them only work as unskilled labor, and there tends to be antagonism between the African intellectuals who go to Britain to study degrees and become part of the middle class English establishment. I mean, at Oxford, I became part of that English middle class tradition, and there was this contradiction all the time. That Christ is the sort of thing which I'm totally against. What am I doing here?
And that's what you told me the last time. The disappointment about the segregation you found there, the same, or more or less, not so much racial as well as
on a class level.
Classes.
Yeah. The white working classes, Jesus Christ, for the first time at Oxford, I had a white servant. She had to come every day to my rooms, sweep up everything, clear my empty beer bottles or whatever, clean up everything. And, on a class level, frankly, there's no racism. The blacks and the white working classes, they suffer the same thing. And they suffer the same sort of, everyone simply looks down on you. And then remember, one of the things which disturbed me was merely that some of us from Africa, especially those who were being very successful in terms of that society, in other words, getting their degrees and getting jobs in the British civil service, or joining private companies right there, waiting for independence here. Even those that did not seem to know that they had become part of an oppressive class. And of course, they'll tell me that Dambudzo, all this flower power, all this hippie thing, all these things about drugs, those are for whites. They're not, a black person must get a degree, must get a good job, get married, and so on and so on.
And how was your life during those years then?
It was rough because I didn't get my own accommodation until about 1979. After I'd published and I was a founder. That's when I joined. Before 1979, in Oxford and in London, I used to depend on friends. Friends would merely say, "Hey man, we've got a sleeping bag. You can come and sleep on the floor. Bring your typewriter. You can just blah blah." But you can't stay long with people, in those situations.
But did you have any income then? Maybe from the House of Hunger, for instance, when it got published.
Heinemann gave me an advance, and I used to haunt their offices, asking for advances all the time. The difficulty there is the difficulty for me in Europe was that, in England, as far as money was concerned, was that because one had joined the counterculture, one did not want to give the bureaucrats you did not want to have any contact with the police, especially. And you see, if you are in exile, the police always, and if you are in exile in England and you are black, the police always, or even most of the white people there, they would always suspect you of being an illegal immigrant. And so there was the social welfare system, the social benefits, and I couldn't go and sign on for social welfare because I didn't want them to check whether my status there was okay or they. You see, when I got to Oxford, in 1970, in 1974, they told me, that I would have to report to the police once every year and renew my permit, my political asylum permit every 12 months. No, I didn't bother. I didn't renew it from the very first year.
But did that mean that you were illegal?
Well, I don't know, but
you were not sure.
Yeah, because I had not renewed it for all these years.
You were not sure about it, so
that if I go,
become in trouble, you didn't go to the social benefit as well.
I don't, because you see, I didn't, because they give all it. You see, they ask you a lot of information, especially about your papers, and then they hand over that material to the police on every immigrant, and so you couldn't trust the people at the social welfare office.
So you kept silent. So
you'd leave them alone, and try and get by.
How did you spend your days during those years after, let's say, you told me after your expulsion from Oxford, you wrote House of Hunger. But how did you spend your days during that time?
Mostly writing, and you see, that's also the time when I knew I had to make some independent, to have my own independent income, and that the only way I could do so safely without having to be employed by anybody was to do freelance journalism. You see, during this time when I was homeless and so on and so on, I was staying with friends, Oxford or in London, or staying in communes, with other dropouts. I was also writing articles for West Africa magazine, and when I published The House of Hunger, the editor there at the time, of West Africa, that time, he simply asked me to be one of their regular book reviewers. So I was doing book reviewing on a regular basis every week. It's a weekly magazine for this West Africa magazine, and I'd get some money from that.
Well, what kind of books did you review then? African writers as well?
No, I avoided writing anything on African literature. I concentrated on, you see, there were three of us. Michael Wolfers, who is now based in Mozambique, and he was here at the last book fair, and a professor of history at Oxford. The three of us were the magazine's regular book reviewers. So they would concentrate specialize on a particular area. I specialized on the Irish question, on the history of Ireland and the Northern Ireland problem. And apart from that, I also concentrated on reviewing books to do with racial conflicts and riots in.
But written by English writers.
Yeah. There's always a problem. I was in a very sensitive area, in the sense that my articles on Northern Ireland. Well, you can imagine Scotland Yard would be interested. I made friends with a lot of journalists who were covering Northern Ireland, because most of the books I'd review were actually written by journalists who had spent some years in Northern Ireland and in the Irish Free State, actually finding out those things. One of them, I think, is Peter Woods. He actually he was also a TV journalist. He published a book about that, and I reviewed it, and then he made it into a film, a documentary, and he got into trouble. Well, the film was, there was the usual question of whether it should be banned, and the government was up in arms. But this journalist had interviewed IRA commanders, and that therefore he was associating with the enemy. That sort of nonsense. And then apart from that, I was publishing short stories in the same magazine, as short stories and single poems.
And did you ever publish them in a book?
No. The poems and the short stories, I always published them singly.
What were they about, those short stories?
Mostly, the poems were mostly about Brixton, the riots in Brixton, and the inner city tensions, and the kind of life I was living with England's own homeless children. I saw some terrible things. You see, one of the things about growing up in a racist tradition was that most of us blacks had the idea that anyone who is white never has any problems. Because you see, the atmosphere here had been created for them artificially. And now here I was, these communes, actually living with beggars, with penniless dropouts who, like me, were also afraid of signing on for social welfare. And girls who had run away from wealthy families' homes and who were trying to experiment with drugs and with Hare Krishna or transcendental meditation, or just getting into anarchism generally, theoretically, of course. The usual phrase, I was living with England's own walking wounded, and seeing this sore, it's like, I don't know, but it's the kind of life which would suddenly make you reevaluate everything. That's why, for instance, people, when they ask me they keep asking me that when I'm going back to London, and I always simply scowl, and then they say, I'm never going back there.